Hi, and welcome to the CIS's YouTube channel. I'm Jessica Brown, and I'm here with Dr. Oliver Marc Hartwich, and we're going to discuss his new report on the future of Europe. Oliver, the 27 European Union member states are meeting today to discuss the European crisis. You argue that this won't actually do anything to solve the issues that Europe's currently facing.
Well, we could say that here we are again, because it's of course not the first of such meetings. We've had loads of meetings in 2010, usually crisis meetings, night meetings on a Sunday night, coming together, solving the existential problems for the eurozone. And then 2 weeks later, they are there again trying to solve the problems, and it's always about another country. It was Greece earlier, it was then about Ireland. It is now basically about Portugal and Spain. It will be about Italy in the future. We've had a lot of these crisis meetings, but they never really addressed the fundamental problems of the eurozone.
So is this the beginning of the end, or can the eurozone be rescued?
I think the eurozone can't be rescued. I'm not even sure whether this is just the beginning, because it's been going for such a long time already. But I think we are getting closer to the end game for the euro, because the euro was a project for which Europe simply wasn't ready, because European economies were never in sync with each other. They had completely different economies. They needed different interest rates, different monetary policies. Europe wasn't ready, and I think European politicians are slowly waking up to that fact.
So do you think that the European Union is something that can be reformed? Is it an institution that will serve the member states well into the future, or is it a lost cause?
Well, the problem is the most desirable structure for Europe, I think, would be to go back to where the European Union was in the early 1990s, when it was basically a free trade zone, a common market. That's what they established, and that was what the Europeans had since 1992. They then took it a step too far. They introduced monetary union. They tried to introduce steps towards a political union. They tried it with the European Constitution that was later relabeled the Lisbon Treaty, but it became increasingly clear that Europe simply wasn't ready for it. So the best that we can hope for Europe is actually to take these reforms back and take Europe back to where it was before.
And is there any support on the ground within the EU for these sorts of proposals that you're putting forward?
There is probably support on the ground if you talk to the famous men in the street and the woman in the street, of course. But if you talk to political circles, probably not, because the euro and the whole European project is such a prestige project for the European political class that they are extremely reluctant to admit mistakes they have definitely made. So with all the political capital invested in that project, it is very, very difficult to reform it.
Now, the euro crisis isn't the only problem that Europe is facing. You argue in this report that there's actually 3 main issues that really are going to determine the future of Europe. One of them is the state of public finances. Does that go beyond the euro crisis?
I think the euro crisis is just a visible sign of it. We have to be fair, the fiscal crisis didn't start with the euro. The euro just made it more visible. There were, of course, countries like Greece and Italy that were already heavily indebted before the start of the monetary union in Europe. So the euro only brought it to light, if you like, but that crisis had been with the Europeans for quite some time. I think it will continue to be a big problem for Europe simply because of demographic shifts in Europe. If you look at a country like Italy, that's already losing people because of low fertility rates. So you wonder, at a debt to GDP ratio of currently 118%, how the Italians will ever be able to repay the debt, because simply there won't be any Italians left in a few decades to repay that.
And this really is an intersection of public policy and demographics. In Australia, I think our median age is about 37. In a lot of these European countries, it's 42, 43. So they're a long way forward in terms of that ageing process. Is this going to be a huge problem? I mean, what can they do to deal with this?
It is a huge problem. They haven't reached the end of that process yet. You said correctly that median age in European countries currently stands at 43, 44 years in many Central European countries. But that's not the end of the road. In the next 30, 40 years, they are likely to reach 50 in some member states. And by that stage, it becomes increasingly difficult to generate any meaningful economic growth. And if you just look at demographic figures, for example, for Germany, that shows you that the working age population is going to shrink quite dramatically. Over the next 40 years, Germany will lose about a third of its working age population. So you can see that that will make it extremely difficult to generate growth, to pay for the welfare state, to pay for pensions. So that European fiscal crisis is only going to get worse with time.
I imagine it also makes it quite difficult to generate the political momentum needed for pension reform when an increasing proportion of the population is actually of pension age themselves.
Absolutely, that makes it extremely difficult. Germany was there 2 years ago. They have a link between earnings and pensions. And in the GFC, that link would have required a pension cut. But that was so unpopular, and no politician dared to do it ahead of a federal election, that they didn't do it. They postponed it, and they pay the pensioners anyway. And that shows you what kind of political pressures there are behind pensions and pension reform.
And can we see, I mean, are these problems uniform across the European Union? Are some countries doing a lot better than others? Is there sort of a model that some European countries are using that others can learn from?
I think the problems are actually quite uniform. Of course, you can see differences in nuances between the different countries, but the basic pressures are the same. And all countries are currently struggling to increase pension ages. We saw the pension protests in France, for example, when Nicolas Sarkozy, the French president, wanted to increase the pension age from 60 to still quite a generous 62. And that got the French on the streets and led to violent riots in French cities. But it's the same problem if you look at Britain, where George Osborne, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, just announced as part of his spending cuts to increase the pension age. The pension age was already increased in Germany. It is about to be introduced in loads of other European countries. So the issues are remarkably similar.
And it seems like the obvious answer to the hollowing out of the workforce is increasing migration. But you argue in this report that Europe's track record in bringing in skilled migrants and migrants to join the workforce is pretty patchy.
That's precisely right. If you look at most recent statistics coming out of European member states, and I take Germany again because it's such a good example, Germany in the last year attracted 660 highly qualified migrants. That's not 660,000, it's 660. They were extremely bad at attracting qualified migrants. What Germany got instead was family migration. And actually, at the same time, Germany recorded a net migration loss. So people were leaving the Federal Republic rather than moving into it. And that's quite unsurprising, really, because if you are a well-qualified engineer, an IT engineer, a computer expert from India, why would you bother learning the difficult German language if you have the option of working in Canada, America, Australia, wherever? It is not attractive to settle in Italy, in Spain, in Germany. I think that's a big problem. So the kind of migrants that European countries, particularly in continental Europe, received were migrants that migrated into the welfare state, but they didn't contribute quite enough to the economies. And I think you can't quite solve Europe's demographic crisis with increased migration, at least not the kind of migration that Europe had over the last 40 years.
So what lessons can we take in Australia from this experience?
Well, I think there are quite a few lessons that Australia can learn. For example, first of all, look at fiscal policy. There are countries in Europe that only 10 years ago felt quite good about themselves when they looked at their budgets. Take Britain, for example. Britain thought they had modest budget surpluses and they had a relatively limited public debt. At least that's what they thought, and they were becoming reckless. They were reckless spenders. They increased government employment, for example, and look where Britain stands today. Look at Ireland, that's basically the same story. Look at Spain, they felt very good about themselves. They had a booming property market, and then the GFC came, and within a 3 or 4 year period, all of this was reversed, and look where Spain is now, and they're talking about a potential sovereign default in Spain. So I think it is quite important to look at these case studies because they really show us what happens if you continuously make the wrong decisions, because that can relatively quickly end you in a state like Europe.
Scary stuff. Thank you very much, Dr. Oliver Marc Hartwich.
Pleasure.
You've been watching the CIS's YouTube channel. You can download this report at cis.org.au. Thank you.